All right. Well, glad you're joining us here for our discussion on our daily Bible readings for May the 10th, 2020. Our Old Testament readings, we finish up the book of Judges. We make it all the way through the book of Ruth, and then we'll start the prophetic books of 1 Samuel, and then in the New Testament we will continue in our discussion of the Gospel of John. So let's finish up Judges. And to put it mildly, it doesn't end well, does it? I mean, these are some miserable stories. They're almost, to some degree, almost embarrassing to even talk about. It's one of those sections of Scripture that really expose the depravity of humanity. With that introduction, I'll give it to you, Calvin.
Well, thank you. You think I'm qualified to talk about that, do you?
Yeah, that's right. We needed someone to talk about depravity, so we invited Calvin Henry to be with us. So,
thank you, Todd. Appreciate that great introduction.
Yeah.
We got cut off at the end last week while we were talking about Samson, and we just want to remember what kind of man Samson was. He was an unusual man. He was violent. He was bad, ill-tempered, and yet God used him.
Yes.
God used him. And so God uses imperfect men to accomplish His purposes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He always has, and He still does. Yeah. And so there are some, very interesting stories about Samson's life, and we find that in the end, really the story is not so much about Samson as it is about the Lord. Mm. There's several passages in there in chapters 13 through 16 that mention the fact that the Lord was with him, the Lord's Spirit was with him. Yeah. Yeah. And when he got to the very end of his life, he prayed to the Lord again to give him strength. Mm-hmm. And it was the Lord's strength that brought that temple down, and Samson killed more people in his death than he did during his life.
Now, was that Dagon? Was that the temple of Dagon there? Because
yes.
that's going to come back up in our reading today. False god Dagon. Yeah,
that's right. Okay, we get to chapter 17 of Judges. After the story of Samson, we find some short, kind of ugly stories.
Right, exactly. Not related to necessarily a judge.
No,
but just some incidents, I guess, representative incidents from that time period, and we don't know exactly how they fit into this time frame, but it's almost as if the author of Judges wants to give us
in some places it seems the timing is a little bit confusing, but at any rate, the stories are interesting. They're not pretty, but they're interesting.
Right. Yeah.
And the first one in chapter 17 is about a man named Micah who had stolen some money from his mother. And
Happy Mother's Day.
He heard her cursing about it.
Yeah.
And he decided to give it back.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so she said, "Well, okay, I'm gonna make you an idol."
Yeah.
And so she had an image carved. She had an idol made with silver, and some other images were cast, some other idols were cast, and she gave those to Micah. And Micah decided he'd set up a shrine in his house.
He's going to start his own, a church plant, so to speak.
He's going to have his own worship center.
Yeah.
And so he sets up a shrine. He decides to name one of his own sons to be the priest. Mm-hmm. We see that God's people are disobeying in every way imaginable.
Right.
Even when they're trying to be religious, they're doing it all wrong.
Right. They're kind of playing it by ear.
Yeah.
They have very clear instructions in the law.
Exactly.
And you could say that there's a little resemblance to the law, but very little. They're just kind of freelancing it as they go along.
He does, seem to be claiming to be worshiping God, but he's not doing it in the right way at all.
Yeah.
The right place, the right priest, God didn't want any images, and all that. In all those ways, he's disobeying. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then we find that a young Levite came by, spent time with him, and he said, "Well, why don't you be my priest?" Yeah, I'd like to have a Levite priest. That's getting a little bit closer now.
Yeah.
Because the priests were supposed to be Levites, and so young guy was looking he was looking for a job, and he found one.
Yeah.
Okay, found a job being the personal priest of Micah in his house, and then we get to chapter 18, and in chapter 18 we find a story about the people of Dan, the Danites, the tribe of Dan. Back in Joshua, it told us that when they had tried to conquer their territory that was their inheritance, that they had not been able to do so.
Yeah.
Apparently they weren't persistent enough or didn't have enough faith, or for some reason they just weren't able to do it. The Lord had given it to them, but they didn't take it.
Right.
And so they were left without any territory.
They're still looking for a place to settle.
Looking for a place to settle.
Yeah.
And that's what it tells us there in chapter 18, verse 1. Those days the tribe of Danites was seeking a place of their own where they might settle. And that's understandable. They need a place. All the rest of the tribes have their territory. They have a place to call home, except the Levites, who have homes among all the tribes. Danites are looking for a place. So they send out some warriors to explore, send out an expedition, and these 5 men are going north, and because their assigned land was down in the south, close to the coast of the Mediterranean, but they hadn't taken it, so they're looking inland and they're looking north, and they finally, they're going through they go through the town where Micah is. And they meet this Levite.
Yeah, they come across.
They said they recognize his voice. I don't think they know him personally, but I guess they identified him as a Levite by the something that he said or the way he was doing his worship to the Lord or something. They identified him, and they said, "Who are you?" And he told them who he was and why he was there, and so they remembered that. And they went on up farther north, way up north of the Sea of Galilee, on a spot on the Jordan River. They found a little town there that they saw was defenseless. It was a town called Laish, Laish, there in chapter 18, verse 7. And it said the people there were living in safety, unsuspecting and secure. They were prosperous. They lived a long way from the Sidonians, and they didn't have a relationship with anybody else around. So, nobody there to protect them.
Yep.
They don't have any alliances. And prosperous people, good land. So they said this would be the place that we ought to take. And they go back with that report, and they come back with the army to conquer that area. And on their way, they spend the night again. They're close to Micah's house. And they decide to steal Micah's idols.
Yeah. Yeah.
They need some of their own. They don't have any, so they decide to steal Michael's idols. They talk to the Levite and say, "You come be our priest. Wouldn't it be better to be a priest for a whole tribe instead of just for one family?"
Yeah,
that sounds good.
A little promotion.
That sounds good. There, preacher's always looking for a better job.
Bigger church. That's right. There you go.
So anyway. He went with them. Micah went after him, or sent men after him.
What are you doing? You're taking not only my priest, but this was all of these, the idols. That was probably a pretty big financial investment for them. Right.
But he chases them, and they turn around and say, you better look out, or we're going to get mad. And they said, "Oh, okay," because they saw they were outnumbered, so they gave up and. They take off, go to Laish, conquer Laish, change the name to Dan, the name of their tribe, change the name of the town to that. And they continue there with their idols and with the Levite priest. And here it gives a name in verse 30, Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses. Of course, the priests were supposed to be sons of Aaron, not sons of Moses. But I guess that was as close as they could get.
Yeah, that's right. Since keep it in the family, I guess.
Okay. So interesting story, but again we see how that religion was corrupted, and how that the people, even in the name of religion, steal and cheat and kill and do all kinds of things, which religious people have since done through the ages in the name of God sometimes.
Calvin, I don't recall if it was in this story or one of the other stories where one of the characters actually makes a statement. I am sure that this is what God wants us to do, and so it does alert us that sometimes we can almost convince ourselves that this is God's will, but we really haven't sought God's will. And so we look at what we believe is right, what we believe is true, what's going to be advantageous to us, and we say, well, that must be God's will, but it really isn't. So these people are very deceived. And again, I don't know if it was in this story or another story.
I remember what you're talking about, but I don't remember exacgly where that passage is. I do remember that earlier they had asked the Levite priest if was it going to be God's will, or was God going to bless them, going to prosper them in their mission to take that city?
Okay.
And he said, he's going to bless you. Whether he actually got that word from the Lord or he made it up himself, I'm not sure.
Right.
Then in chapter 19 has an awful story in it about a Levite, another Levite, different man, from the hill country of Ephraim. He had a concubine, and she had been unfaithful to him. Eventually she'd go back to her father's house in Bethlehem, and he decided he'd take her back. So he goes down to his father's house and gets ready to bring his wife back. The father-in-law receives him very well. Is glad that he came for her. They eat and drink and party for
a few nights of
3 days,
reveling.
and then on the fourth day he's going to leave. But on the fourth day, he said, "Well, come on, stay another night." So he stays another night, and on the fifth day, said they start. He was ready to leave in the morning. He said, "Well, just wait till the afternoon." And so, they waited way late in the day to leave, and got caught by dark in the middle of nowhere.
So they had to find a place to stay.
Had to find a place to stay. And so it was the Levite, his concubine, and the Levite's servant who was with him. And they came to the town of Gibeah, and it's dark, it's night.
I guess they're going to sleep out in
they go to the
Central Park or whatever.
Go down the town square, the Central Plaza, I guess it would be, and just there waiting. Maybe hoping somebody would come by, or maybe they think they're going to just have to spend the night there.
One of the provisions of the law is to provide hospitality for people, and that's one thing that we're not seeing here. People are just not protecting one another, just not being hospitable to one another.
Except here we find one old
man comes by. Right.
He's coming back in. He's old, it says, but he's not too old to work because he's coming in from the field. And it's already dark. And he sees them there and says, "What's going on?" And they said, "Well, we just don't have a place to stay." And he said, "Well, you can stay at my house." So they went to his house and they stayed there, and but it wasn't a very good experience, obviously.
No, it didn't work out well.
Because some wicked men of the city came to the door, perverted men, wanted to take him out and have their way with him, rape him. The old man, who was a gracious host, said, "I cannot allow that. Hospitality rules would not allow that. I just can't allow that. You can't do that. It's a perverse thing. It's and finally he said, you can have my virgin daughter, and you can have this man's concubine."
Really?
Which sounds terrible to us, and it was terrible. But he's looking for a solution, And so eventually the Levite puts his concubine out the door. She's abused all night long.
It's a terrible story.
And she comes back the next morning early and gets back to the house where they were staying, and makes it as far as the front of the house and falls over and dies. Okay, he comes out the next morning ready to go. He sees her there, says, "Let's get up and go." Very gentle fella.
It's really
it's
incredible.
It is just almost unbelievable Here's a man who's supposed to be a religious man, a man who's supposed to love this woman because he decided he's going to go after her and take her back.
Right.
And then the way he treats her.
Right.
But then he realizes she can't get up because she has died.
Yeah. And the story gets even worse after this. And then, if you thought that was bad, then he's gonna send a message to all of the tribes of Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's kind of, in a way, hypocritical because he's so indignant about her death, but he himself was guilty.
Didn't try to protect her at all. Yeah.
He himself was guilty too, and he sends out a message by cutting her body into 12 pieces and send it out to the 12 tribes, and they all are alarmed and horrified and say, what's this all about? So they get together and listen to the man. He tells his story. If you read his version of the story, it's not exactly the same as what we read earlier in the chapter. He says, well, they wanted to kill me, and so he changes it a little bit. But anyway, the people say, okay, this is an awful, awful thing that the people of Gibeah have done, and we will do war against them.
Right.
And they did. Okay. And they went to Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin, where Gibeah was. Said, turn over the people, the men who are guilty. Turn over the people who are guilty. And if they had been halfway smart, they would have done that.
Right.
But they didn't.
Benjamin says
they were outnumbered. But they wouldn't turn them over, and they went to war, and a lot of people died on both sides. But eventually, the Israelites totally decimate the Benjamites, and kill all of them except for 600 men. Okay, all of them except for 600 men.
A tribe of Israel is almost wiped out because of this conflict.
One of the
Benjamin
tribes,
is
the tribe
almost
of Benjamin,
gone.
Almost totally, because they've killed all the women and children. Apparently, they burned up the houses. All are left are the 600 men from the army who had escaped and gone off to another place. They're the only ones left. And then the Israelites get to thinking about it and say, we've destroyed one of the tribes. We're not 12 tribes anymore. What are we going to do? It's awful.
And the Israelites, the other Israelites, had made this pledge never to give their women to a Benjaminite because of this conflict. And so with no women to carry on the name,
in their anger, they had made that pledge, and then later they're saying, "Oh no,
what have we done? What have we done?
What are we going to do?" Yeah. So they had to figure out a way to keep the tribe of Benjamin alive without breaking their vow. Right. And so the first thing they did was they said, "Now, when we had our big meeting, was anybody missing?" Yeah, people from this one town were missing. And said, let me tell you what verse.
What was the name of that?
Jabesh Gilead. Okay. No one from Jabesh Gilead had showed up at the assembly. They said, okay, they were ordered to come. They didn't come, so we're going to go in there and destroy them and take. We're going to take some of the young women, virgins from that tribe, to supply wives for those 600 men. Well, they did that, but they only got 400 young women. Okay, said, well, we're still short. They don't have enough women for all of them. Then they told the Benjaminites, okay, we have an idea. You still need 200 more.
Yeah.
There's going to be a festival over here in Shiloh, a religious festival. When the young women come out to dance, you guys be hiding there in the vineyards close by. And when the young women come out to dance, those of you who don't have a wife, go steal you one.
Right.
Okay. And so that's what they did.
They kept their vow because they didn't officially give over their daughters to the Benjaminites.
No one gave their daughters voluntarily.
They set up these women.
And they explained to the people of Shiloh why they had done that. And said, don't seek vengeance. It was the only way that we could provide for the ongoing existence of the tribe of Benjamin. And so that's how they handled it. Very, very moving stories, very sad stories. And the reason there was so much so much anarchy, so much sin, so much violence, so much confusion is explained in the very last verse.
The very last verse of Judges, a sad ending to this book.
In those days, Israel had no king. You'll see that said several times in the chapters before this. Israel had no king. And what did that mean? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no unity
Yeah.
Among the nation of Israel.
Yeah.
We see civil war. We see a lack of respect for the law, lack of respect for women, just depravity. That's how we started it.
Yeah.
That's how it ends. So, all right. Well, that wraps up the book of Judges.
Yeah.
Now, thank God for the book of Ruth, because Ruth takes place during the same time period, and just when we think that everything is bad, just when we think that there's no one who fears God at all, then we have the story of Ruth, which is an example of, in spite of the national depravity, there are some individuals, and again, this is a good story, and I'm sure there are other good stories taking place, but this represents the fact that even in a culture that has departed from God's way, there are some people that are still seeking after God, and that God is still working, because the book of Ruth, the book of Ruth ends on such a high, positive, hopeful note, and lets us know that God is still working through all of this mess. And one of the people that He's using is this Moabite woman named Ruth. So let's go ahead and it's a short little book, powerful story though.
Well, it is a short book, and we don't have time to spend much time on it. I think everyone knows the book of Ruth pretty well.
Yes.
You know. The verse from Ruth is quoted at almost every wedding you go to, almost. And the story is well known. But as I reread this story this past week, I was moved.
Yeah.
If
you don't read any of this week's reading, read the book of Ruth. It's a short read, and it's a good, powerful.
It's a story that we've heard so many times, and yet when you read it again, and you just really look at the character of these people. These were good people.
Boaz, I mean, he's a man of character. Naomi, of course, she goes through her time of depression, but again, it ends on such a happy note. God is working.
They were good people. It's a story of true love and devotion. It's a story that confirms the wisdom of God's plan. For instance, the plan for a kinsman redeemer, and the fact that God had made provision, for tribes and to continue to be known, and a man's inheritance to continue.
And for women to be cared for. In that culture, a woman needed to be cared for.
Right. And the wisdom of God's plan is proven there in His compassionate laws. The law, of the gleaning, being able to go behind the men in the fields and glean when they were practically starving to death, but that saved them from starvation. And then, as you mentioned, the goodness of Boaz, a righteous man. He could easily, if he'd been an evil man, taken advantage of Ruth. But he was a very righteous man, very good man, a noble man, and it's really a beautiful romantic story. It really is.
It's exactly what we need after those stories in Judges.
And I think it also, at the very end, you've already mentioned how it ends, is giving us a little genealogy there. And showing us and explaining to us how that a Moabite woman
mentioned in
got
one of
into
the
the genealogy of the king of Israel, King David, and therefore the genealogy of Jesus.
Right.
And so it is a beautiful story, and I enjoyed reading it again this week.
And it's really it's a connection also between the period of the Judges, and then it looks forward to the birth of David, who is going to be Israel's premier king. And so, this is kind of foreshadowing this new period that's about to dawn on us with the beginning of the book of 1 Samuel.
Right. Well, Samuel also is an interesting book. 1 Samuel we find that Samuel was really an answered prayer.
Yes,
he was an answer to prayer.
And we see another godly family, Elkanah and Hannah.
Right.
Yeah.
And how she, she prayed. She was first sad, very sad, and she had been mocked by her husband's other wife, who had children. She had none, but she kept on hoping, and she prayed, and the Lord answered her prayer. And we're not going to go into all the details there. We hope everyone has read it. If not, you need to. It's a wonderful story of how the Lord answers Hannah's prayer, gives her a son that she has promised that she will devote to God.
Yes.
And she keeps her word. And in chapter 2, we find her own prayer of thanksgiving and praise to God for what He had done for her. Okay. On the other hand, we find that the current priest, Eli, head priest, and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, especially his sons, are extremely corrupt.
Yeah, scoundrels.
Scoundrels,
that's how the
thieves.
NIV
They really have no moral values
taking
whatsoever.
advantage of their position as priests.
And Eli apparently was not a bad guy, but his main problem is he did not discipline his sons. He did not control his sons. And
there doesn't seem to be a mother involved. I didn't research that, but
I haven't researched it either.
But I don't know
about the mother. What happened there?
Yeah.
But in any case, God holds Eli responsible.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's sad. Eli had received Samuel into the
right. So Samuel becomes like a son to Eli.
Right.
And Samuel, of course, is going to grow up and become the great prophet, one of the first prophets, or last judges. I know there's that kind of debate. Is he a judge? Is he a prophet? Is he both? But he has this great relationship with Samuel, who he's kind of adopted more or less as a son. As Samuel lives with him and is serving in the temple. But then his own sons, Hophni and Phinehas, like I say, they just grow up and just meet a bitter end there in a battle.
God had told Eli that He was going to destroy his family line as far as being part of the priesthood.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to allow him to be the priest anymore. Yeah. He said, I had promised that, but under these conditions, you can't do it.
Right.
You can't do it. And so he told Eli that was going to happen. And actually the first revelation that the Lord made to Samuel was that sad revelation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that story where
in chapter 3, the boy Samuel hears the voice.
Yeah. He's in bed at night.
He thinks it's Eli. It's night. He's been asleep. He thinks it's Eli. No, it's not. 2 times. Third time, Eli said, you better go back and wait and say, when you hear that voice again, say, here I am, your servant. Your servant listens. And that's what he did, and the Lord spoke to him. And the revelation that He made to Samuel was precisely that he was ready to kill the sons of Eli, do away with them.
So Eli asked Samuel, well, tell me what it is. Tell me what it is. And Samuel's a little hesitant to tell Eli, but Eli says, hey, just shoot straight with me, and he does.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah.
And
Samuel,
Eli says, let the Lord do what He does.
The young boy Samuel having to tell that to Eli, it had to be hard, but he did. Yeah. And we find that Eli said, well, He's the Lord. He has spoken, and He will do what He'll do. I
think Samuel's kind of an underrated character in the Bible. We know his name, of course, we're 1st and 2nd Samuel, and he kind of he's interspersed in some of these stories. But I gain a great appreciation for Samuel, his dedication and his giftedness by God, and how he really turns around a nation that has been very disobedient, and there's going to be a revival, and Samuel is at the heart of the revival.
You're right.
So kudos to Samuel. He's a good guy.
It tells us that at the end of chapter 3, the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and He let none of his words fall to the ground. I think that means all of his prophecies came true. He revealed things to him, and all those things were true.
And then all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, which is north to south, those are kind of the border cities there in Israel, all of them recognize that Samuel is a prophet of the Lord. So he has a very wide.
So really, this is apparently the first time in a long time we have that kind of agreement.
Right. Yeah.
Here's a man from God. It says back at the beginning of the chapter that in those days the word of the Lord was rare.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
They weren't
3:1.
They weren't
that's
receiving
an important verse.
They weren't receiving very many prophecies.
Yeah.
And now God has raised up another prophet.
Yeah.
So the people apparently are very glad to accept Samuel as a prophet of the Lord. Chapter 4, we find the Philistines capture the ark.
This is a good story. There's good and bad in it, but it's a good story.
The Israelites had lost a battle to the Philistines. They say, why did we lose the battle? Maybe we should take the ark out there with us.
Right.
Well, that's one of those things where it wasn't a good idea. No. They should have consulted the Lord first,
Yeah.
It seemed like a good idea.
Yeah.
If we just have the ark of the Lord with us, then, He'll take care of us.
That's going to guarantee victory.
Guarantee victory.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
the Philistines were afraid when they saw the ark. I mean, they did give a little fright there.
It gave them a fright, and also I think it gave them determination. We're going to have to fight harder, and they did.
Yeah, they did. They won.
And they won.
Yeah. The Philistines overcome the Israelites, and in the process take the ark.
Yes.
Along with Hophni and Phinehas.
Yes.
The sons of Eli.
They kill Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's sons.
Yeah.
They take the ark. A messenger comes back and tells Eli what's happened.
Yeah.
And
he's an old man at this point,
yeah,
too.
He's an old man.
Vision.
Sitting at the gates, and he falls over backwards and dies.
Yeah.
Terrible. But interestingly, it doesn't say he died. He fell over when they said your sons were killed. He fell over when they said, when he heard the words, and they took the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
That was
even more devastating to him.
That was the worst thing he could imagine. Yeah. Okay. So we find the Ark of the Covenant, that they now have in the Philistines' hands, wasn't such a great thing to have in your camp. Okay.
They think, ooh, we've got the Ark of the Covenant.
We got the power now.
Yeah.
And it's kind of an interesting story how they tell how that they decided they put the ark in Dagon's.
This is 1 Samuel 5.
Yes.
This is a great story about how God demonstrates His power over the Canaanite gods.
The next day, they find out that he's bowed. That Dagon is bowed down. His idols bowed down before the ark.
Right.
The next day,
what's going on?
Who
played this prank?
Next day, not only is he bowed down, his head and hands have been cut off.
Things broken off. Yeah.
So they decided, we got to get rid of this ark.
Let's let another city, Philistine city, enjoy the Ark of the Covenant.
So wherever they take it, the people are cursed with a plague, one kind or another, tumors, rats. So nobody wants it anymore.
Nobody wants it. Let's give it back.
Okay.
Yeah. So return to sender.
They decided to return the ark, and they do that. And chapter 7, it tells us how that, at the end of chapter 6, it tells us that God struck down 70 men from Beth Shemesh where they returned the ark, because those men had dared to look inside.
Yeah.
Okay, they had not respected the ark as they should have, and so God punished them. The ark, though, they sent it on to Kiriath Jearim. They took the ark there, and it stayed there for I think 20 years.
Yeah.
Chapter 7, the Philistines were subdued at Mizpah, and at Mizpah, is where just outside Mizpah is where Samuel put up a large stone called Ebenezer.
Yeah. Here I raise my.
Thus far has the Lord helped us. That's what the word means. Yeah. Thus far has the Lord helped us.
Yeah.
And so it served as a memorial of God's help to the people of Israel when they finally overcame the Philistines. Okay.
All right, so that ends our Old Testament reading, and things have turned around, at least for now, and things are looking brighter for the people of Israel. They're finding some sense of unity. They're having a legitimate prophet of God, Samuel, leading them, and so we're looking forward to how else God's going to use Samuel and continue to work in the nation of Israel. All right, so let's go to our New Testament reading, just a few chapters in John chapter 3 through John chapter 6 and verse 21.
Okay. Well, actually, last week we were supposed to cover the first couple of chapters of John, and we got cut off.
We got cut off, yeah.
So I'm going to really briefly summarize that real quick. We find that in John's gospel, it's not like the other gospels.
Nope.
It's different than the other three.
A lot of unique material.
Order, in terms of material, and especially it gives more of a theological interpretation to things than the other three do. We find the others full of actions, and we find more explanation about who Jesus was in the book of John. And another interesting characteristic of the book of John is John never mentions himself by name. Okay, you don't find the name of John, the apostle or the disciple, in the book. You find him later on called the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Right.
Very interesting. Anyway, it's a great book. I love the Gospel of John.
So many familiar stories, encounters that Jesus has with individuals, has a very high, what we call high Christology.
Yes.
As we develop an understanding of who Jesus is and his relationship with the Father and his nature. And so a lot of times when we're looking at who is Jesus, is he divine, is he human? The book of John kind of sheds a lot more light on that divine aspect of Jesus than the other Gospels. Not that the other Gospels don't promote that or teach that, but John's Gospel really, from the very beginning, no stories of Bethlehem, no stories of
he starts off different. He starts off
cosmological,
not with the birth. Actually, he starts off even farther back, in the beginning.
Right. tying the story of Jesus to the beginning of
the Word.
Creation.
The Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah, that's a beautiful introduction.
And in verse 14, the Word became flesh and lived among us. Which that's a beautiful thought.
Yeah, and that word, Greek word logos, which sometimes you'll hear in reference to who Jesus is.
The message of God, the Word of God. We have seen His glory. Okay. And then verse 18, no one has ever seen God. The only Son of God, who's at the Father's side, has made Him known.
Yeah.
If we really want to know what God is like, let's learn about Jesus.
God in the flesh.
Learn about Jesus, and we'll know what God is like. Okay. Okay. John the Baptist is mentioned as one who was a witness and a forerunner for Jesus. He was a humble man. He said, I must decrease and he must increase. Great man, John the Baptist. Great man. And then we find the first of the miracles of Jesus in Cana of Galilee. Interesting note is, in John, the miracles aren't called miracles.
Right.
They're called signs.
Signs. I always uses that term.
The word sign is used constantly for the miracles. They were there to show something.
Right.
They weren't just nice, compassionate acts of Jesus. They often were that, but they weren't just that. They were signs.
Right. Okay. And when you get to the end of John's Gospel, I mean, he states his purpose at the end. These have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And so the book of John is almost structured around these signs, and depending upon how you number them, there's 7 or 8, 6, 7 or 8. But that number 7 is so appealing to biblical scholars that we see these 7 signs that are always accompanied with some type of teaching revealing about who Jesus is. So the miracles of the signs in the Gospel of John
from the very beginning,
very tied to his identity.
From the very beginning, in verse 2:11 says this was the first of his signs. And he thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him.
Yeah, exactly. That's the purpose of the signs.
That's the purpose
to develop
of the signs.
faith.
Okay. Then we have the story of the clearing of the temple, or cleaning of the temple in chapter 2, which is interesting that in John's gospel it comes toward the beginning.
Right.
Whereas in the other gospels it comes toward the end.
Right.
And the question is, who's right, or did it happen twice?
Right.
And we don't really know.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Okay. 3, the story of Nicodemus.
Yes.
Okay. Nicodemus was a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus by night. We're not sure why by night. Some speculate why, but we're not really sure why. But he came to Jesus by night.
May not have been good for his reputation as a member of the council.
May not have been good.
Or it could have been just that Jesus, he's surrounded all the
catch
time.
Jesus, that's right. Who knows?
I mean, yeah, he's so busy
Right.
that this is a time where he can really have this one-on-one conversation with Jesus. And we'll see that a lot in the Gospel of John, these conversations that Jesus has.
And he
with
says,
individuals.
we know that you're a teacher from God. No one could perform these signs that you're doing if God weren't with him. Okay? And then Jesus takes the opportunity to teach Nicodemus about a really important spiritual principle. He says, unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus didn't understand, and I don't guess I blame him. A question, a statement like that coming out of the blue. What does Jesus mean? Okay, what does Jesus mean?
I can't go back into my mother's womb and be born again. What is this all about? So
he said, you shouldn't be surprised in verse 7 that am I saying you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound. You cannot tell where it comes from or where it's going, and so it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Some things we don't understand about the wind or about the Spirit. Okay, but you must be born again.
Spirit and wind can be interpreted the same Greek word.
Same word, yeah. Okay. And then follows the famous passage of talking about Jesus' purpose of saving us, giving us eternal life. He says, just as Moses was lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And there it's talking about his death. John clarifies that over in chapter 12 when he says,
a little foreshadowing
here. He's talking about his death on the cross. He says he must be lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life.
John 3:16 is right in this conversation that he has with Nicodemus.
So Jesus is explaining to Nicodemus, and the writer explaining to us what Jesus' purpose was. It was to give us eternal life.
He didn't come to condemn. We were condemned already.
He
didn't come to condemn us. He came to deliver us.
Right. Okay. Then later on in chapter 3, we find mentions of the testimony about Jesus. Jesus mentions 2 kinds of testimony. He says, there was a testimony of John the Baptist. He says, I don't seek for men's testimony about me, but so that you'll believe. Remember, John the Baptist gave testimony to me. He said that I was coming. He prepared the way for me. When Jesus was baptized, the Spirit came down upon him, and John says, "This is the one. This is the one coming from God." And then, in addition to that, he says, you can receive only what is given him from heaven. Okay, a man can receive only what is given him from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Christ, but I am sent ahead of him. So John testified, I'm not the Christ, I'm the one who was sent ahead of him. I jumped ahead of myself. The other we're going to see later on.
Yeah, the testament. Jesus is not really concerned about what everyone else thinks about him. He's convinced. He uses John as an example. Here's a witness, and that's I think that's a recurring term that occurs in the book of John. John there's a lot of light, darkness, testimony, truth. A lot of these words and themes are repeated throughout the gospel.
Okay. But he says, but men love darkness rather than light. He came to give the light, but men love darkness rather than light. Okay. Chapter 4, the story of the Samaritan woman, is a very interesting, well-known story. We've all heard it a lot, read it a lot. I
like how it begins in verse 4. He had to go through Samaria, which really he didn't have to go through Samaria. There were routes. Of course, the Jewish people would try to avoid Samaria if they could. But this seems to be almost a moral imperative that's placed on Jesus. He has to go to these people. There's a purpose for making this particular trip, going this particular route.
Yeah, we'll find the disciples did not want to go through Samaria.
Right.
It tells us in other Gospels, but Jesus wanted to go through Samaria. And he had a message there. The woman is convinced by Jesus little by little. First, she's surprised that he'd even talk to her because she's a Samaritan woman. Then, when he talks about giving her living water, she's a little bit questioning what's that. What are you talking about? Then she's shocked to find out Jesus knows everything about her.
He must. This guy maybe is a prophet.
And finally, she is convinced that Jesus was someone special. She goes back to her town and says, "Could this be the Messiah? Could this be the Christ?" Maybe she wasn't 100% sure, but she's kind of thinking that. And then other people from Samaria come out. And they see Jesus, and they're convinced themselves. They say, not because what you said, because we saw it with our own eyes, heard him with our own ears, you know. And they even invited Jesus to come and spend a couple of days in their town, which he did.
Settles down in Samaria for a couple of days.
Unheard of for the Jews. Okay.
Yeah, so many, him speaking to a woman, him speaking to a Samaritan, just breaking down walls that had been built up over years and years, walls of prejudice. That Jesus is destroying. Jesus' ability to take just normal everyday things and begin a spiritual conversation is so impressive. He's at a well. Let's talk about water. Let's talk about living water. He's always focused on that. And I like when disciples come back. Hey, we got a bunch to eat. Are you hungry? I'm not hungry. My food is to do the will of my Father in heaven. I mean, Jesus is so obsessed with doing the Father's will, he forgets about eating. I mean, that's not important to him.
That's how important it
is. It really is so much about who Jesus is and what the gospel is about in the story of the Samaritan woman.
Okay. Later in chapter 4, it talks about Jesus healing an official's son. This man, this was the second sign in Cana of Galilee, it says. It was the second when he healed his official's son. Then in chapter 5, the healing at the pool. The older translations include some verses there that might be dubious whether they're part of the original. As far as this pool being moved, the water's being moved by an angel, and whoever came into it first got healed. But for some reason, there seemed to be some healing power in that pool. Maybe it was thermal waters, or it says whenever they were moved, people would go down into the water. And this man, when Jesus said, "Do you want to be healed?" He said, "Yeah, I want to be, but I can't ever get there before everybody else does."
I can't get there.
And so Jesus healed him. Okay.
And 38 years he's been struck with this.
After 38 years of being crippled.
And it's the Sabbath.
That's the problem. It's the Sabbath day. Jesus says, take up your mat that you've been lying on and walk. And the Pharisees or the Jewish leaders see him and they say, "Hey, what are you doing carrying that mat on the Sabbath day? You're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath day." He said, "Well, the man that healed me told me to."
Who was it?
Who was it? Well, I don't know.
I didn't get a name.
I don't know who it was because Jesus had immediately disappeared in the crowd, and he did not know who it was.
You think he'd find out, who's this guy who helped me here? But Jesus does come back to him. He finds him in the temple. "Hey, how you doing? I see you're well again." And then that guy turns Jesus in to the authorities. "I found out who did it."
Well, I'm not sure if he was turning him in or if he was just proud of Jesus.
Well, maybe he thought. The man
that healed me was Jesus. But I don't know. Hopefully he wasn't turning him in, but he might have been. I don't know. I never thought of it that way. Some of us more skeptical. Okay. Then in chapter 5, Jesus talks about the true life coming through him as God's Son. He talks about himself being the Son of God, the Father and the Son. And said that the Jews persecuted Jesus for two reasons. One, because he did miracles on the Sabbath day. And two, even more so because he called himself the Son of God, made himself equal with God.
So this is bringing up the thought of blasphemy, where Jesus is claiming a relationship with the Father that is inappropriate if it is not true.
Exactly.
And Jesus he never denies how they understand what he's saying, which seems to be he's complicit with this understanding. The Father and I are one. There is a different relationship between between Jesus and the Father than what we have, and this is troubling to the.
And Jesus claims, that he is the Son, that he can give life, that he will judge.
Yeah.
Because the Father has delivered these things into his hands.
The Father works, I work. Okay. What the Father wants, I want.
It says, whoever believes in him has eternal life. Mm-hmm. And then verse 28 says, all who are in the grave will hear his voice. Mm-hmm. Okay.